I've got another 9 by 12 inch transparent watercolor to share with you today. This is a painting of a green heron, which is one of my favorite wading birds. I had to wrestle a lot with this one to get it to cooperate. I'll try to walk you through what was working and not working as I went through the process of painting this one. I did my sketch based on a bunch of photos of a cooperative bird in Pennsylvania. I had a few dozen sketches to choose from, so I kind of cherry-picked from the best of the photos and assembled them into one painting. For this watercolor, I only used liquid Friskit to mask off the bird, the main perch it was sitting on, and a few smaller stems and leaves. I mixed a bunch of green colors to use and started filling in my main leaves, putting the pigments on dry paper. By working on dry paper rather than pre-wetting the paper, your color saturation is higher. My greens were various mixes of phthalo green and lemon yellow for the lightest and middle value colors, phthalo green and cadmium red for the darker colors, and then added in some ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple for the darkest areas. I typically like having a variety of greens ready to choose from, with some more saturated than others to keep it interesting. For this painting, things were a little more on the saturated side. Again, working on dry paper, I started putting in the first layers of water with some greenish blues, followed by a streaking of a reflected wave pattern using a number 4 round brush. My goal was to cover as much of the page as possible before adding much detail. Once everything in the background had a base layer, I started glazing in some shading to the leaves using my premixed greens. My first passes were just to start establishing my lighting by adding some darks rather than worrying about rendering any serious detail. That will come later. Eventually, I started adding in glazes to begin building some texture to the leaves, like their veins. I was switching between number 2 and number 4 round brushes depending on the size of the area that I was working on. Once I started building texture on the leaves, I began pulling some of my premixed colors and adding in other paints on the butcher's tray. I started bringing in warm colors with chrome orange and cadmium yellow medium to some areas and created other cooler, darker tones using ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple. I tried to mix up the color of the leaves, making some more blue-green and others sort of a pea-green color. With a painting of a green heron on a mostly green background, all those variations in color, temperature, and value are going to be really important to balance if I was going to get it to look right in the end. By glazing in countless overlapping layers of transparent paint, you can build convincing textures. On most of my paintings, there aren't many areas that don't have a dozen or so passes. Often the backgrounds are one of the few areas in my watercolors where the paint was a single layer floated in on a wash. Not on this painting, though. Every square inch had tons of glazing and dozens of layers. Now, both techniques can be good solutions. It really just depends on what you're rendering and the look you're going for. Early in this painting, I spent a lot of time working on the leaves rather than the water. This was for 2 reasons. The leaves really took up more of the frame, and the water is usually pretty fast to get blocked in. I worked across the page trying to develop everything at about the same level of detail. My plan was to have most of this painting in focus, giving up a little bit of detail as things progressed toward the top of the page. One problem that can result from having everything in even focus and detail is that it can actually flatten out your painting. Loss of focus, atmospheric perspective, and fading in and out can really tell a lot when it comes to depth. If everything is equally focused, you lose all those other cues and you have to rely on shadows and overlapping to build your depth. That was where this painting started to give me some issues later. More on that to come. After a lot of time on the leaves, I started adding in some water detail with darks. Some extra shadows on the leaves helped them pop a bit more too. One of the dangers of masking off your foreground is that you have a tendency to base your background on the white of the paper rather than the actual colors that will be there in the end. I think that also caused a few problems down the road. The background was looking good at this point, but knowing that the bird's going to be mostly dark greens means it is really going to blend in with those leaves in the water. I guess this is one of those things that seems much more obvious when you see it on screen as opposed to on the drafting table. For the water, I began to bring in some ultramarine blue as reflected sky color to separate the leaves from the background. Eventually, I used more of those same paints as a fill color in my shadows. With the bulk of that background done, I peeled off the Friskit and revealed the white of the page. After that, I transferred my foreground sketch to the watercolor paper using the tracing paper transfer trick. A link to a video showing how to do that will be in the video description. Well, honestly, I thought things would speed up at this point, but I was definitely wrong. Well, it zipped along for a while, but it ended up having a bit of a slog to get things finished once the bird was mostly rendered. I started off the foreground by blocking in my lightest local colors with number 4 and number 2 round brushes. For this part, I was mostly on autopilot and things developed pretty quickly. Once the primary pass went in, I started glazing in the details in many layers. Almost everything from here out was done with the sharp number 2 round brush. Many overlapping layers on the feathers and bark made for fairly convincing textures. I used a bunch of my ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple reflected sky color to create my basic light-dark shading on the bird and its perch. Green herons have always been a favorite bird of mine. First, they sure are beautiful. In addition, they are a lot of fun to watch and they have many interesting behaviors. One of the more exciting ones is getting to see them catch dragonflies. Their speed is just amazing. They'll be hunting away at a fish and then turn on a dime and snap up a big dragonfly right out of the air as it goes cruising past. That takes some crazy fast hunting skills. At this point, things were feeling a bit flat, and I wasn't so happy with the painting. That green leaf right by the heron's face was distracting. The bird's head and beak didn't have good separation from the background. The water along the top needed a lot of cleaning up. With watercolor, it's always a good practice to work light to dark, and I still had plenty of areas that I could darken up to fix the problems that I was seeing. To be on the safe side, I scanned in the painting and tested out a few options in Photoshop to see what needed to go darker. This can be a handy option if you aren't sure what to do and you don't want to ruin what you already have on the page. 10 minutes of tests can save you hours of time. Once I had a plan of what needed fixing, I started by using darks to push back the leaves by the bird's face. More grays were added to the bird's belly, as well as some additional shading to the big leaf below the bird. I brought in some serious darks around the bird's head, towards the top of the painting, and under the leaves towards the left. For these darks, I used phthalo green, cadmium red medium, ultramarine blue, and dioxazine blue in varying amounts. I also selectively went around and added some additional shading to some of the other leaves to add extra separation and depth. I ended up scanning in the painting and testing things in Photoshop 3 times, just trying to figure out how dark certain areas really needed to go. That almost never happens to me, but it's nice to do some tests before committing to the final piece. Late in the painting, I used some of my ultramarine blue and dioxazine blue to add more shading to the bird's body, hoping to round it out a bit more. I used those same colors to add additional shading to some of the other leaves in the water. I thought the neck needed a little more punch and brought in some more saturated darks using alizarin crimson and dioxazine purple. In the end, I was pretty happy with the painting, and I think it finally had good separation of the bird from the background. Some paintings seem like they should be really easy, but they end up being complicated. And this was one of them. You never really know until the paint hits the paper. Well, thanks for taking the time to have a peek at this effort. I hope you get a chance to get out the watercolor soon.